Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Crypto Hipster Podcast. This is your host, Jamil Hassan, the Crypto Hipster, where I interview founders, entrepreneurs, executives, thought leaders, amazing people all around the world of crypto and blockchain. And today I have a really amazing person and an interesting company project. My guest name is Alan Orwick. He is the co-founder of Quai. Alan, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Jamil. I'm excited to be here and tell you a little bit more about my story.
I'd love to hear it. First of all, let's kick off with your story. What is your background, and is it a logical background and story for what you're doing now?
For the most part, I think so. So I actually got started in crypto about 2015, was in Bitcoin and Ethereum, and was really drawn to it because I was getting into programming. I was getting into computer science and trying to understand how the technology worked. And that led me into the University of Texas, where I was a student studying computer science. I founded Texas Blockchain, which is the undergraduate blockchain organization. So was the president of that for a couple of years, grew that to several hundred students. And then that really led me down the research rabbit hole. So I was able to get connected with colleagues, professors, and others that were like-minded in the Austin area, and really thought what we want crypto to be and how we want to create these systems. So following graduation in 2020, went and worked at Apple for a couple of years as a software engineer. I was actually in the Austin area as well, as on the supply chain side, but got the crypto itch, decided to get back in the startup space, and was able to leave Apple and get started with Quai Network and really grow the team and grow what we're doing here. And yeah, I think there's been a lot of different paths in my career that have allowed me to really work with amazing people in the space and very bright people that really want to push the industry forward for crypto.
Very cool. I was in Austin for the first time in my life in May.
Oh, nice. For
Yeah,
consensus, probably, right?
for consensus. Yeah, I love the town. It was great.
Good. You get some barbecue and hang out, go down the lake.
Yep, I didn't go to the lake, but I had barbecue. It was probably some of the better barbecue I had in my life.
Nice. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Hopefully we can have you back soon.
Next year, I hope. So thank you. So let's talk about Quai Network. What's it all about? And why do you guys I don't know if you call yourselves this, but I think I saw it somewhere, the only fully scalable and programmable proof of work layer one not named Bitcoin?
Yeah. So, when you think about crypto, you have to think about the core primitives of the use cases. And with Quai, our goal is to create something that is fully scalable and programmable. So those two terms kind of on their own have to be defined, right? Because scalable can be a little ambiguous. So scalable to us means something that can achieve extremely high throughput, anywhere north of 10,000 transactions per second, 50,000 transactions per second, and so on. So something that can compete with the likes of a Visa, MasterCard, or the credit networks or the banking infrastructure that we already use today. So scalable has to be defined in a way that actually means real, tangible throughput, something that Quai can accomplish, and something that other newer blockchains are beginning to accomplish as well. Second to that, when we say programmable, it has to have a nature of interacting with the blockchain or interacting with other parties in a decentralized way. So things like smart contracts, the EVM, or other forms of virtual machines that allow for trust minimized ways of facilitating interactions with third parties. So having that settle on a network, doing sort of third party asset issuance, or doing things like settling trade or DeFi. So having that on Quai Network on a scalable network so we can keep fees consistently low.
Got it. So you guys have created two coins, right? One of them is a
Mhm.
state pegged energy. The other one, I want to find out actually about both and how they work.
Yeah, definitely. So I touched on those two kind of first points on scalability and programmability. And the way that Quai is unique that I actually didn't allude to yet is we're doing this on a proof of work network. And so a lot of people have different assumptions and beliefs about what proof of work means or does or what can accomplish. Bitcoin, as you mentioned earlier, is notoriously proof of work. And in many cases, we see the industry has really shied away from proof of work lately, and they've moved towards proof of stake. They've moved towards layer twos, and there's a lot of excitement around that, rightfully so. But for us, we see there has to be ways to innovate within proof of work. And so when we say we're the only scalable and programmable proof of work network, that is the case. A lot of proof of work networks do lack those features. In fact, all of them lack those two combined. But now when we say, well, what does it mean to have this new form of stablecoin alternative? And I'll use alternative specifically because it's not directly pegged. It's more of a manifestation or a mechanistic design around the use of energy. And that's because we found a way to oracleize the properties of proof of work and use that for bringing that real expenditure, so that cost, that miner input cost that for many miners is denominated primarily in energy, and manifesting that on chain. And so a two token design is utilized in which one of those tokens is like the store value or more of the sort of volatility coin. And the second one that we call chi, almost like Tai Chi or the energy inside of you, is supposed to be that decentralized energy dollar or dollar alternative, stablecoin alternative, given it's not directly pegged to a dollar, it's not one-to-one backed, it's emitted proportionally to hash rate is actually how we do that. So every time you give the network one hash, it will give you the same amount of chi. That differs from something like Bitcoin that sort of arbitrarily halves. Satoshi created this schedule and said, all right, every 4 years you get half the amount of Bitcoin. And that creates a lot of mimeticism and a lot of excitement whenever it can happen. I think looking back this year in April, people thought it was going to happen on 420. So those kind of random distribution or random disturbances in the Bitcoin issuance can cause some turbulence in the market. But for us, we sort of thought about it differently from an economic standpoint. And that's how we create that two token design within Quai network.
I'm thinking here. You said something really interesting that probably might go over a lot of people's heads, but I want to dive into it before we move. You said you oracleize the proof of network. When I think of oracles, I think of Chainlink. I think of other, RLC, other, proof of stake oracles. Yep. How do you actually oracleize, the proof of work as far as price, as far as data feeds? How do you actually do it?
Yeah. So when we talk about chi as an asset and we say it is tied to energy, what we mean is actually the global average energy cost, because there are many different miners across the globe. And so if you look at miners, as we talked about with Texas, there's a lot of Bitcoin miners in Texas, and they're tied into ERCOT and they run. And then whenever it gets really hot in Texas, they might have to shut off their Bitcoin miners, or whenever we have flash freezes, they have to shut off their Bitcoin miners and put that energy back into the grid. So fundamentally, those miners may run at, say, 6 cents a kilowatt hour, compared to someone in Germany that is running on hydroelectric or running on a wind farm that might be getting 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So all of these miners have different costs. And so they're going to have different levels of profitability based off of the energy that they need to contribute hash rate. So they have a certain amount of GPUs and a certain amount of computers that are mining this network. And when they do that, there's a game theory or incentive design for them to mine either one of the tokens based off of their profitability. And that ties into that process of oracleization, because they have that real energy denomination that goes into the creation of the token itself. So when you think about Bitcoin miners, they get that sort of constant rate of Bitcoin whenever they mine. So that's consistent block reward. But with Chi specifically, as it's tied to hash rate, that emission would vary based off of the participation in the network.
Got it. So you're able to create variable rates based on the activity.
Yep. And miner preference as well. So activity and miner preference based off of this game design. And so everything in crypto boils down to game design and incentives, right? The network and the infrastructure is meant to facilitate these value transfers. And then the tokens on these protocols are meant to make people act in different ways at the benefit of the network and at the benefit of adoption. So when we look at how we want this token to be utilized, we want it to be utilized as a way of stability in a way. And what does stability mean to us? We see energy as a better denominating source for that. If you look at purchasing power over time or inflation, some of the key drivers there are energy, oil, nat gas, you name it, many of the other ones that are emerging, such as solar. So we're confident in a very energy abundant future, but we see a money tied to energy is the most useful form of money.
It's ingenuous. I like it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been
Yeah,
a lot of research to get to this point, amongst
I would
other
think
things.
so. I would think so. Yeah. Um, so we are headed toward a increasingly compute centric economy.
Mhm.
So it's more important than ever before to build scalable infrastructure. Going back to the word of scalability, how do you scale your infrastructure, and why is it important to do that now?
Yeah. So I'll talk about infrastructure at a few different points. So great question, by the way. When we look at a proof of work network, there are many sort of tiers. And we were just talking about the miners. And miners to us are a very critical aspect given that they have the incentive to mine this token. And the larger you get, the more global incentive there is to find these pockets of energy. So cheap electricity that can be utilized to turn into cryptocurrency. And that also pairs nicely with data centers and AI. So when we look at infrastructure and how that's utilized, we have people that are going to, say, El Salvador and mining on top of volcanoes because they can get free electricity there that's not being utilized for extremely cheap. You have the same for Texas that are putting Bitcoin miners on flared natural gas or flared oil wells, in which that they are capturing that methane that's being emitted and converting that into a consumable fuel for their Bitcoin miners. And then on top of that as well, when we look at the existing data warehouses that are doing large AI processing or large compute for, say, AWS, GCP, there's an incentive for these people when they're not running those intensive systems to be using it for cryptocurrency. So I think we're going to see an emergence of infrastructure that is more crypto ingrained and also more AI ingrained when we think about how these jobs are pairing. I won't say, the AIX crypto category is super thought out yet, but it's getting there. And the infrastructure play first, I think, is the most useful because you're seeing Bitcoin miners also dabbling in running GPU or running other AI sourcing and AI jobs because they have that connection to the energy. If you look at the main bottleneck of AI right now, when we talk about infrastructure, it actually is access to energy because it's so intensive to run this processing. And then as we scale out other infrastructure, now that we have data centers and this ever-growing need to run this type of software and access it across the globe, we have to look at how this software actually runs. And so the code itself as an infrastructure. And with Quai, we've uniquely designed it so that we can shard and subnet the network. Those are two very important properties that also are tied to a lot of the research we did, in which sharding allows us to break the blockchain into many different pieces. That is not a new idea. It's actually been around since 2016, and other protocols have implemented sharding before. And so there's different types: data sharding, execution sharding. We're more on the data sharding side, in which there are many different blockchains are running in parallel. And then the subnet idea, in which the shards actually co-locate or are correlated to a specific network topology. So you can imagine a shard running in North America, a shard running in South America, a shard running in Europe, a shard running in Asia. And the benefit of that from an infrastructure standpoint is if you look at how these nodes are connected, they actually can reduce their latencies and increase their bandwidth. And so you can imagine now, instead of it taking a second to talk to somebody across the globe, you're taking a quarter of a second because they're just a couple states away or a couple countries away. And that makes it more efficient in terms of network propagation. And that infrastructure allows us to scale and reach that throughput that I talked about earlier. That makes it usable for global commerce and people to actually tie it into payments and real world use cases for accepting and using crypto that we've been limited by.
Interesting. I'm still trying to picture, the methane out of Texas. Like, I didn't even think that, about that,
Yeah.
And it's interesting. So you hear all this about, about ESG investing,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't hear people combining Bitcoin or other proof of work networks with ESG investing to keep, the narrative is they're separate because Bitcoin takes too much energy, right? How do
That's what
you
they like to say, but continue.
I was going, how do you deal with those false narratives?
Yeah. proof of work gets a bad rap, right? And I think that's one of the many reasons why, as I talked about, the industry has gone so heavy into proof of stake is because we have this big ESG narrative, and we're starting to see some of the ramifications on that and how it might have put us into different areas of research or thought that might be more of a sort of local minima as opposed to what is fully achievable. And look at an asset like Bitcoin, one of the things I'm very passionate about whenever assessing these types of protocols is actually saying, well, Bitcoin is actually sort of net negative for emissions because a lot of people are running their miners on not only the flared nat gas or oil wells, but they're also running it on landfills. And I've talked about this in other talks, but if you look at landfill methane emissions, they're anywhere from 30 to 50 times more potent to the atmosphere than CO2. And so for that Bitcoin miner to tarp a landfill and get a consistent 3 to 7 megawatts on the 3,300 landfills that exist in the United States, that's a pretty lucrative opportunity for them to say, hey, these landfills aren't going anywhere. This trash isn't being moved. And I know this landfill will emit a certain amount of methane for 15 to 50 years. And so people can take those opportunities and set up there and create that infrastructure. So kind of going back into, what other ways are people creating and building out this infra? I think one of those is the landfill methane mitigation that would be explored. And then also thinking, if you look at how to frame this in a better light from a green or a environmental perspective, is the sort of cop-out answer is like, well, how much waste does our traditional banking infrastructure use, right? Like the people driving to the banks to work in a box all day, or the people having their ATMs that they have to go swipe, and then the people that have to refill the ATMs and transport that. So that's a pretty intensive process. So I think to some degree people are okay with the energy expenditure that goes into these networks, and you have to find a level that is reasonable in thought process, but then also counter with the narratives that there are ways to make this green and there are ways to benefit the environment and to create that incentive to go and source that energy. Because once you source that energy as well, it may be more profitable to sell it back into the grid. So if you imagine you're looking at a landfill that's miles away from a city and it takes $1 million every mile to connect it, it may not be profitable now to reconnect that landfill, but maybe in 10 years it might, whenever that city grows and it's a little closer to the landfill and there's more demand in that city for energy. So I think those are some of the business impacts of crypto that people can see, and then also tie that with sort of carbon credits that the government issues or other sort of ERIN processes that you can go and get as a business. But we're not particularly in that industry. We want our miners to explore that, and we want to offer Quai as a way to have sort of different types of mining for these people that have GPU capacity. And so, for us, those are the many things that we just try to tell people is like find the cheapest energy and participate in these ways to do it in a renewable way.
Sounds really intriguing to me. Something else I'm intrigued by is your co-founder. I saw a video of your co-founder speaking about Bitcoin failing his money. Where in that lifespan do you feel that Bitcoin failed his money? What lessons has the world learned from that failure, and how are you fixing that mess?
Yeah. So when you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin is still emerging. And I think taking a step back and we look at the life cycle of currencies, I think the US dollar is still sort of coming off of its prominence. And we're living in a world in which the US is losing a lot of its dominance. I'm an American, I love America, but I think we have to look at the facts and we have to say, how do we ensure that we can create this sort of empire, this American empire, and sustain it? And it's hard given, we're so spread out and the debt is growing, and fiat currencies are more recently new as well. We went off gold in 1930s, and then more recently in 1970s transitioned other countries off of that. And for us, Bitcoin, I still think is rising in terms of adoption as a currency. So we can't really say Bitcoin has failed yet, but I think we're seeing some of the warning signals that Bitcoin is ossifying to the point that will open up potential avenues for failure. And I think some of those, as they talked about in the video, are the security budget. So when we look at these arbitrary halvings, what happens to the blockchain in terms of security whenever the fees continually go down? and the transaction fees are not keeping up for that. If we look at hash price in terms of the revenue that miners are getting today, I believe it's roughly 5% away from an all-time low. So the 5% away from the lowest amount of Bitcoin in US dollar terms being paid out to miners. In the history of Bitcoin, that's not a good thing, because then we can't actually support the network in terms of the economic activity that is occurring on it. Because if you're sending a certain amount of Bitcoin, you want that to have a certain amount of economic security so that it's a transaction that can get settled in an appropriate manner. When we did a lot of analysis and we actually took out energy prices and inflation, we actually saw Bitcoin hash rate in terms of net energy peaked roughly around 2017, 2018 in terms of like peak Bitcoin. And we've been actually on a decline since, if you think about the energy expenditure going into it. And so for us, we have to think about, what is actually the driving forces of what a monetary system should be. If we think about it as money, well, how much, or if we think about it as energy, not money, for how the system should be designed, how do we get the most amount of energy going into these to secure them? And then how do we create monetary systems based off of energy so that we can transact more freely of control and of this sort of censorship resistant ways that are imbued into fiat and these other currencies. So for us, I think Bitcoin still has a bright future. And I think, we don't want to put down any other systems, and we want to learn from them and acknowledge how we can improve them. And we're attempting to do that with Quai.
Makes sense. I didn't realize we were in a downward spiral. When I see other proof of work chains, with improving hash rates, it's a little bit more competitive of an environment now.
Well, I think hash rate is a bit of it can be a bit of a conflating term, right? Because if you look at just pure hash rate, well, a lot of the machines have improved by, 2 to 3x. So now instead of getting, 15 terahash, you're getting 105 terahash for the same amount of energy. So I can still have a 3,500 watt machine, but that 3,500 watt machine is no longer, it's 10x the hash rate for the same amount of energy. So looking just at a hash rate number, there's a bit of an argument there of like, is just the amount of hash rate fine, or is the actual manifestation of the energy preferred? And for us, we want the most amount of energy going in because that's the economic influence of the chain.
Got it. So I believe in a decentralized future, right? I believe in a multi-generational decentralized future.
Yeah.
But what does that look like to you from three-dimensional areas, social, financial, and political?
Yeah, I mean, for us, and my thoughts on decentralizing this and creating a better future, I think moving away from centralized forms of control in which people are able to influence your life on a day-to-day basis and monitor what you do and have overarching reach into your day-to-day life is like the reason why we have to build these systems. And if you say in the future where you ate too much steak, or you drove your gas car too much, or you did things that can be tracked and recorded and then limited in terms of your freedom to move around as an individual, I think is not the future we want to live in. And it's definitely not the future that I want my future kids to live in. And it's up to us to build these systems that allow for sovereignty. And we've gone through this process in which we sort of saw the separation of church and state and the idea of religion being on its own, and how individuals are able to practice their religion in the United States and how that's a free society for people. And I think America, as I talked about, is one of the places that people actually have a lot of freedoms there. And so we're getting to the point now where people are seeing, well, what if I want freedom to choose what money I use and how I hold and store value and how I represent my choice of finances? And so crypto is this great fight in which we have to really take it on ourselves to create the separation of the state and the money. And of course, that's a very hard fight because it is a very entrenched piece of the state to own the money and have control of the people through the money. And the only way we can fight that is not to, go into these systems and try to make them better from the inside out, but create separate systems and create new enterprises that allow people the mobility to take on a different kind of asset ownership, take on a different form of money. And if you look at decentralization, then it's say, how do I create these long-lasting systems that are robust for people to participate in for long enough time? And so Bitcoin may accomplish that in the short term, as we already talked about, but what does that look like for 100, 200 years, 500 years, and so on? And what systems are going to be around, and how do we create those incentive schemes to keep people interested and keep people on the same network and participating together? And I don't know if we've really figured that out yet. And I hope with Quai, we can take the next step in experimenting and having a way of designing a system that might encourage different kinds of behavior. Again, using that token to align incentives and to create intended or discourage unintended types of behavior, and pair that with some of the other systems that are out today. So some of the larger blockchains that are also experimenting with how to create these multi-generational decentralized systems.
I like that answer. I'm going to ask you about this because I don't bring it up to anybody.
Sure.
I want to bring it because you know what you're talking about as far as money. We had something around the world called COVID.
Mm-hmm.
When COVID happened, the U.S. money printer printed a whole. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows we went into debt.
Mm-hmm.
But what did it do? It enriched the people who were sitting at the top of corporate America.
Mm-hmm.
They got more money than everybody else, even though they were failing to lead their companies. Their companies were failing, and they weren't able to be leaders, and they were just given a whole bunch of money. So it masked an entire generation of non-performers.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, the non-performers got money. Everybody else got screwed. You know, the money supply needs to change in order for us to come out of debt in America. How can people rely on Quai to help equalize or bring that money shock back into the equilibrium so people can see where they're headed in the future?
Yeah, I think for Quai, particularly in this use case, thoughts on everything else you said before aside, and if I were to answer that question directly, it is, how do we create crypto that can be perceived in a light of actual experimentation and use case away from traditional forms of money? And so I think to get to Quai, you have to kind of go down an existing Bitcoin rabbit hole, right? You have to kind of like start in Bitcoin or Ethereum and then like work your way and find and discover Quai. But we'd prefer that to not be the case in the future. And we'd prefer it in which Quai is actually a lot of people's maybe first time using crypto. And we want that to be open and accessible. So what that means is low fees and ease of use and access. So can you do it in the places that are already frequented in your day-to-day life? So can I go into a convenience store and pay with Quai? Am I booking something on Shopify? Can I pay with Quai that way? Can I mask that experience such that you're not even really sure you're using a blockchain, or you have a cryptocurrency as part of this transaction? And that's, I think, limited in many ways, not only by technology, but of like thought and mind of the people that are in blockchain and how they're developing these things and how they perceive the world in the future for it. Because a lot of people, I think, do got caught up in sort of the nuance of use cases and research. So creating something very practical in which you can say, here is a real product, ship this and get it out to as many people as possible, get people using crypto. That's one of our goals. And allowing that to be something that is sort of unconstrained and able to spread like wildfire is the hope. And so getting people's first time into crypto in a way that is a good experience, because like ultimately that's what I want for people. And I know for me, I think in many ways is, product driven and trying to refine this product, and something with like crypto is very hard to understand in many different ways. It's something that people have very visceral and gut reactions to if you talk about crypto kind of across the board. And so I think for us, it's a matter of making that experience more pleasant and thinking about it from first principles, in which if you think about how a money system should be thought of, I want to take part in that money system, because money ultimately is just kind of value transfer between the people and almost stored time or stored experience, and manifesting that and putting that in a way that is able to be digested and able to be used day to day is a meaningful thing.
Yeah, I agree. We still need to have that fungible token that everybody can use, like the cent that that you can just use, not and not as use a store as investment, but actually like transactions. So
Yeah, and we didn't go down the rabbit hole of like stable coins and like how those are being adopted and what that looks like for the rest of the world. But there is a very bright future for stable coins as well. There's over $150 billion of stablecoin market cap. We're seeing 350 billion plus in terms of volume over 7 days. So, people are actually using these things, and there is demand for the dollar across the globe. So, if anything, the US needs to wake up and see that people want demand for US treasuries and by proxy stablecoins, or vice versa in that regard. So for us, it's like, well, how do we actually use blockchain technology for the benefit of getting dollar adoption, and then what other kind of currencies can also take part in the process. So stable coin problems aside, I think that's an interesting area.
I don't. I mean, I tend to like from my investment hat on. I tend usually not to ask about stable coins because they bore me.
Mhm.
You know, they're not fun and exciting. They're not. They don't have speculative access
Mhm.
portion, right? But they are beneficial. And there are a lot of governments that are in favor of them, and a lot of governments who are against them.
Mhm.
You know, what's the pros and the cons there? And how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the people that actually need crypto most, uh, they don't want volatility, right? Their local dollars in Argentina, Venezuela, Turkey are inflating 100% year over year, and so they don't want that negative volatility. They want stability, and so they seek stable coins. And actually, those are some of the first and foremost crypto users. Those are the people that are paying with this stuff. And so we say, actually, in the United States, we're very blessed to have a running financial system in which we're good with the dollar, and we can go pay with Visa, MasterCard. But there are people that are in these countries that are actually using crypto to pay day in, day out, and they are some of the main people that are using these systems. So I'd see that kind of like as an emerging market trend in which that's an area of crypto that's going to continue to grow.
That makes a heck of a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sometimes I take off my one-sided hat and learn something new every single day, which I so appreciate it. Thank you. Um, I do want to know. I do have one last question because I am, and this is not promotional content.
sure.
I am going to be a speaker at the Litecoin Summit. I'm hosting a panel there. You
Nice.
know, asking about Litecoin mining and how do you compare Quai to other proof of network networks like Litecoin, like some others? How do you stack up?
Yeah. So as I said and kind of led with, we are the only scalable proof of work network with smart contracts. So we are the only system that can run this high throughput, have this adaptive network with EVM programmability. We saw so much demand for the EVM. We still do. Pitfalls of the EVM aside, it's the most widely adopted and most robust form of smart contract programming on the blockchain today. And then pairing that with insanely low fees on what we see as the most secure and objective form of consensus being proof of work, to many, that's a no-brainer. And so we're excited about that future. We're excited to introduce that into the market. And for other things like Litecoin and other proof of work coins, a lot of them have ossified. And so it's hard for them to get a lot of upgrades. It's hard for them to stay on top of an adaptive, changing market. And for us, we can really utilize a last mover advantage in this space to capitalize on other research and advancements.
Sounds good to me. That sounds really good. So I want to thank you very much for speaking to me today. I have one last question.
Hit me.
How can people find out more information about you?
Yeah,
Your network, about anything you're up to, about Quai. How can they do that?
sure. So you can visit qu.ai to visit our website. On Twitter or X, we're at Quai Network. And then we have our docs available at qu.ai/docs. YouTube, we have a large presence as well. As you said, you've seen Dr. K speaking about Bitcoin and other things on YouTube. There's a ton of great content there, so check that out. And then join our Discord if you want to hang out in the community and run a node, run a miner, and participate in testnet, more than glad to do that. So ramping up for mainnet launch this year and excited to keep everyone involved as we do so.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Jamil. Appreciate you having me.